Hello, welcome to another episode of Blog Roast. And today we're going to be talking about this article, The Anatomy of a Content Refresh. And this was submitted to me by the Verblio team, wonderful content marketing agency, wonderful people there. And a really good starting point for evaluating any piece of content is to work out, is this doing something positive for the company that published it? And I think in this case, resounding yes. This passes the ultimate test of content marketing. This is something that I think is very useful for their business. And that is because, as a content marketing agency, as somebody that helps run one of the biggest challenges we face is trying to get companies to think of us as more than just the rote providers of new blog posts. That tends to be the default interaction between a company and agency. You create new stuff for us. But what is better for us and better for the customer is to have an ongoing relationship where we are involved with across the entire lifespan and spectrum of all of their content. So content refreshing, talking about that, framing that narrative, explaining why we should be hired and support you with updating old content, and actually it's a fantastically financially useful thing to do. One of the best bits of content any content agency can publish. So, through that lens, this is a huge successful article. I love it. I think everyone that deals in content marketing should have some kind of thought or narrative around content refreshing, historical optimization, whatever you want to call it. But this is Blog Roast. So, in the spirit of trying to make all of us hopefully slightly better at our jobs, I want to talk through three things that I would potentially change or at least keep front of mind were I to update or write a new version of this post. And those three things, if I can now remember those three things, delivering on the promise created by your title, MECE, the structuring of articles to make them mutually exclusive and collectively exhaustive, and weasel words and how they quite often creep into writing. So let's full screen this bad boy. So, anatomy of a content refresh. It's quite a popular framing, the anatomy of. I found an article on my old freelance website I published 11 years ago that was the anatomy of a landing page. Very popular. If we think about that, what are we promising the reader with that title? Obviously, as this skeleton shows right here, when we say anatomy, we are promising a detailed anatomical look at the structure of a thing. We want to understand how it fits together, how to make it, how to reproduce it ourselves. That should be the thing we keep front of mind when we evaluate this article. Does it deliver on that promise? And I think looking at the table of contents, we start to see a couple of minor problems emerge. So quick aside, table of contents, fantastic thing to do. Any long article, really recommend that. But scanning these headers, when we talk about the anatomy of, I want to spend a lot of time on how to actually do the refresh. What are the mechanical things that I, as a content marketer, can sit down and do to refresh something? And we have a section here, executing, which is great, but it is one of many sections and it is quite far down the hierarchy. And actually looking at these earlier sections, this principle of MECE comes to mind for me, which is whenever we scope out an article, we want to cover the topic in as much detail as is useful and is necessary, whilst also avoiding any overlap between subjects and avoiding topics that are not relevant to the one thing we want to talk about. So collectively exhaustive means that taken together, all of these headings tell a complete story about content refreshing and how to do it. And mutually exclusive means that there is no overlap between these sections. We're being as terse and concise with our writing as possible. And right from the get-go, I see lots of things that are not mutually exclusive. So identifying content that reads a neat refresh and prioritizing content refresh work, these are to me subsets of the same thing. I don't think you can identify content that needs a refresh without prioritizing it. So it feels a little bit strange to me to have those as separate headers. So I would condense those down together, and I think the structure would improve for it. And these two as well, why you should do a content refresh. I think that's some small allowance for this is useful. It's a bit of context for us, but in terms of people Googling content refresh and hitting the enter button in their search results, they probably have at least some sense of why to do it. That's how they know it's a thing. That's why they're searching for it. And as I said before, the meat of this article needs to be how to do it. So actually, this is okay, but it's also very duplicative of this section. This, to me, is not a very good introduction because, for one, this is a header that doesn't say anything. It tells you it's going to say something. So instead of telling me what the purpose or the strategy or how to execute a content refresh, it's telling me that we are going to break these down. So it's kind of talking around something as opposed to telling me something, which I think a header should do. And there's a lot of things in here which are just fairly obvious, fairly inane, and as I say, kind of repetitive as for this section. So I personally would condense these down to one very short introductory section and make things a little bit simpler there. So getting down to executing the refresh, again, this is the thing that I think should be the substantive, largest part of this article. And already, by the time we get down to here, we're already halfway through. And instead of having a lot of intense detail about how to execute the refresh, it's basically framed as a quick summary. So this, to me, gets the weighting of information fundamentally wrong in this article. It fails at the whole MECE attempt here because we've relegated the really important bit, executing, to a relative footnote, whilst there's a lot of context and build-up that the reader probably doesn't need in order to get to this point. So this could just be the article in its own right, and I would argue maybe it should be. Now, the problem that causes is weasel words. So a weasel word is basically a phrase or a sentence that seems at the outset to be helpful and illuminating, but when you actually sit down to try and act on the advice it shares, you realize it's kind of hollow and empty and doesn't actually help you do anything. So there was a great example in here. Let's have a look at it. When you try and cram lots of things into a relatively small space, like has happened within this article, you basically force yourself to not explore important topics in as much detail as is required to be MECE. And weasel words are one of the common manifestations of that. When you write them, you feel like you're conveying a lot of detail, but you're actually not. And there are some great examples in here. So how old should content be before you consider refreshing it? If we look at the answer, there are lots of weasel words in here. Content takes time to ramp up. It sounds like it kind of makes sense, but what does content ramping up actually entail? What are we looking for? What are the things that increase and ramp up? Are we talking about the number of keywords? Are we talking about the traffic? Probably, and a smart reader may be able to infer from that, but there's a lack of precision and usefulness there, which I would probably change. You want to make sure it's matured before you take time to refresh it. Well, what does it mean to mature? What are the things you are looking for to say yes or no, this article has matured? Tools like Screaming Frog can help you determine if the content is fully baked. If I open up Screaming Frog and I put my website URL in, what am I looking for to determine if the content is fully baked? What does that actually mechanically mean? You're most likely looking at impressions to confirm that the content is relevant and generating traffic. How do you take impressions, which are a number, and what is the thought process required to work out whether that content is relevant and generating a good amount of traffic? Not to hammer this point home too brutally and too hard, but this is the biggest problem that comes from trying to cram lots of things into a relatively short article, is you don't go into enough detail where detail is required. I think that is the fundamental problem with the executing the refresh section here. Where was a good example of this? Each of these steps could arguably be, 500, 600, 1,000 words if you wanted to go in as much detail as possible. And this kind of maps back to something I talk about a lot, which is lots of people talk about things like the importance of analyzing data or the importance of editing, but they don't go into the actual granular mechanical details of analyzing data or editing. What are the actual things you do that you are looking for when you perform that process? The ability to explicate those is what makes content incredibly useful and helpful. So here, do a quick proofread for grammar. That's fairly self-explanatory. Yeah, adding content. What kind of content should we add? I'd like some examples to make that a bit more relevant. When you come to add content, what are the things you go, oh yeah, we'll add that in? Maybe you would look at the SERP and you'd see topics that other people have covered that you haven't. Maybe there are things you've learned since writing it that you would add in. Just explicating that in a bit more detail. Lists or tables, it's kind of great at a high level, but how does that really help me add in lists or tables? How should I know when they are relevant? Can you provide me with some examples of when that might be relevant? See, that's good. Make sure links to external resources less than 2 years old. Opportunities for new types of content. There's a huge amount of thought and decision making smuggled into that idea. When would it make sense to include videos or images or transcripts or quotes? It's very easy to say you should add those in, but the harder thing is working out when that is relevant. And, you know, the thing I will say last of all is actually this section here, the bonus section, which feels like a little bit of a throwaway, could actually be the most valuable part of this article and is probably something that I would frame the entire written part of this article around. Actually seeing somebody do a refresh, this is exactly the thing I want to see. I want a human being to talk through their decision making and their thought process and actually show me examples of it in the real world. So this may not be very substantive or very useful, but this is the missing component. So actually I would bump that right up and make this whole article about seeing an expert do a content refresh and then maybe trying to summarize some of the generalizable takeaways that come from it. Cool. So generally I will say this is a good article. It's really well written, and actually it's a very brave thing to submit an article to a show like this, to have somebody talk through and tear down when you are not around to fundamentally defend and advocate for your content. Everything I've shared is just my personal opinion, and I think this passes the most important test, which is this is a useful concept that will generate business for the company that's published it. If you are looking for things to take away from this, I would probably say deliver on the promise of your titles wherever you can. Think through that and work out what you are promising people. Try and keep the MECE framework in mind wherever you can to make sure content is structured and weighted appropriately to deliver on that promise. And be wary of weasel words, things that sound useful and substantive but actually are maybe not that helpful. Cool, thanks for tuning in.